in 2006, when the civil war erupted in Iraq between the Shia and the Sunni, this conversation became very, very important. You need to be educated and you need to educate your kids about it, because if they were stopped by a checkpoint and they were asked a simple question of what is your last name, and we have given the wrong answer, you will be executed on the scene. And despite all the chaos that was happening in Iraq, my father said, we're not leaving Iraq. We might die here, yes, but we're not leaving Iraq. That was not until 2006, November. That was November 3rd of 2006. My father received a phone call that his cousin was found drilled to death, naked, and throwing on the trash in Baghdad street. They contacted my father to go pick him up. My father went to pick him up, and he found out that his cousin's body was full of explosive material. So when my father get close to him, it would also target him. And eventually the police picked up the dead body and took it to the hospital. And they asked my father to go do the paperwork and pick him up from the hospital. When my father went to the hospital to pick him up and do the proper paperwork, the way it was done at that time, because the hospital was receiving many, what they call them an unidentified dead bodies. And they're unidentified because after they torture them to death, they would strike them from their IDs. So the way it was done, that every unidentified dead body come to the hospital, they would take a picture of the body and put it away in the morgue. So when the family come to look for their loved ones, they would have to look at the pictures one after another until they be able to identify their loved ones. So my father sat down and he was going through the pictures until he got to his cousin's picture. Only on that day, his cousin's picture or number was 167. So he literally sat down and he had to watch 166 image of people who were brutally murdered to death until he was able to identify his cousin. And after he did, the militia group were waiting for my father at the hospital's door to target him. So eventually my dad said, I can't identify him, and he left. We did not give him the proper burial just because if we attempt to do, then we would have lost my father as well. So when my father came back home, he said, pack your stuff, we're leaving tomorrow morning. And we said, but you said we're never leaving Iraq. He said, no. The way I've seen monsters in Baghdad killing people and killing each other, this cannot be human. How can I imagine that one of my kids be killed and tortured to death in this brutal way? I imagine my cousin begged for his life because he has 7 children waiting back home for him. So he said, pack your stuff, we're leaving. And I remember the last day I attended school, as my school was getting empty little by little. My friends were leaving. A lot of them were leaving out of the country. My other friend, her brother was kidnapped as well. So this just became the norm. You wake up in the morning, you don't know if you will survive that day. So on November 5th, we meant to leave Iraq, and that's when Saddam Hussein was sentenced to death. That's when the Sunnis were out on the street trying to revenge for that decision. So the Iraqi government announced it 3 days curfew. Nobody goes out on the street, just so to spare the lives of some Iraqis not being killed in those 3 days. And on November 8th, the morning of November 8, 2006, on my sweet 16th birthday, we were heading from Iraq to Syria seeking refuge. And I still remember that morning when We left Iraq. It was a bit cold in the morning. The waves of many, many cars were all leaving Iraq towards Syria. And I believe it's very safe to say November of 2006 was the very peak of the civil war in Iraq. I remember the car right beside us that was full of women and a little child who kept every now and then just gaze at me from the window and would wave at me. So in the car, it was the driver driving, my father at the front, my brother right beside me. It was me, my little sister, my mom, and on her lap was my 6 months old sister. And we were heading all to Syria. Hundreds and hundreds of cars all heading towards Syria. As I'm sitting in the back seat in the middle, I have a clear vision of the street. And the car right in front of us, as we were hitting traffic, I saw 3 armed men got out of their cars and they came right back at our car. Just simply guns to my father's head, gun to my brother's head, and guns to the driver's head. Simple question, what is your last name? My father said our last name, and our last name could be either or, could be either Shia or Sunni. So the terrorist guy, call him a terrorist, he followed up asking a question to make sure our last name could be either or, but he wanted to know whether we were Shia or Sunni. So my father knew that we were hitting the area of Fallujah, which is dominated by Sunni, and they were revenging for Saddam's decision to sentence to death. And my father went on explaining to them that we were from a Sunni background, as my father was from a Sunni background, and they did not shoot. So they asked for our IDs. And my dad put all the IDs before we left with my mom. And he explained to her that if he said Sunni and they did not shoot, they investigated more and they did not shoot, then she had to hide her ID because her ID would identify as a Shia last name. And if they find this out, then the entire family would be murdered. So my father asked my mom to give out our IDs, and of course she hid hers. They looked at the IDs and they threw it back at us and they said, drive. They wanted to make sure we were Sunnis, so we were not the people to be killed today. The next car to us with that little boy, they asked him the same question. What is your last name? And apparently they were Shia. I remember them start shooting, but then I don't remember anything after that. I remember I opened my eyes and we were approaching Syria, the Syrian border. And that's when I opened my eyes and I thought I was dreaming. So I asked my mom and she said, we don't know. And I said, but they start shooting. She said, we don't know. We did not see them. And I think Iraqis would like to believe that theory of we don't know, we haven't seen. Just because it's hard to face this reality. It's hard for many of them to just go as numbers. And I don't even know if they went as number and as statistics. So that was the journey on my sweet 16th birthday. By the end of the day, we made it to Syria. We lived in Syria for 2 years. I was transitioning. I was being in a high school. I was living through the experience of a culture shock, as many of hundreds of thousands of Iraqis who were living in Syria. And I finished my high school in Syria. And then as I was finishing my final exams in Syria, we received the news that we will be resettled to the United States in 2008. And that is when I was resettled in the United States in 2008. And in my head, a whole challenge and struggle started in the United States. First, I felt the entire time that I was forced out of my roots. I was taken out of my roots from Iraq to a journey that I did not want. I did not want to lose my friends. I did not want to lose my home. I did not want to be displaced. I don't want to be labeled as refugee. I am not a refugee. I have a country that I want to go back to. I faced a lot of challenges here. I still remember one day when a guy who was recording me in his phone, and he just came in laughing and saying, "Hey, are you a terrorist?" And I just looked at him and I said, "What?" And he was like, "Oh, I'm sorry. Do you know how to make a bomb?" And in my head, I was thinking about all of the stereotypes that refugees have to face. I mean, refugees, they go through a very strict process in order for them to be able to be resettled into another country. They would have not become a refugee if they were just not fleeing conflict and war zones. And I resented this idea of accepting that this is the new reality for me. I resented the idea that I want to be in the US. All I thought it was like, this is temporary, and I'll go back to Iraq after I finish my degree. I finished my my bachelor's, I finished my master's, and then during the time I was doing my master's, that's when Mosul was liberated from ISIS in 2017. And at that time, I was a mother. My little daughter was 3 years old. So I was looking at conflict from a different context. The way I was looking at conflict at the beginning was, I'm a child and I'm looking at the conflict from a child lens. But then I'm a mother and I have my own child, and I can just imagine as a parent how difficult it is for other parents around the world to protect their children from such war and atrocity. So as Mosul was being liberated, I was going through this crisis of how parents are going to sleep knowing that their children might die. That was just another whole another challenge for me to understand. That is when I decided that I want to go to Mosul and I want to film a documentary and I want to talk to people and I want to hear them speak. So when I decided to go to Mosul, my husband was supposed to come with me to film and I would just do the interviews. But on the last minute came that my husband's ID, Iraqi ID, was expired, so he wouldn't be able to go inside Mosul with me. So I had to go in by myself with my dad's friend. And before I went inside Mosul, I was trying to make sure that I got everything. I picked up the camera and I asked my husband, I said, "How do you turn this on?" And then I listened to myself saying this and I said, well, I cried and I'm like, what am I doing here? Do I really think I'll pull this off, just going inside Mosul, and I don't even know how to turn the camera on? And that's when my husband had the conversation with me and he said, well, let's take a step back. Why do you want to go to Mosul? I said, because I want to hear people. I want them to talk to me, to tell me their stories, to feel that they're heard. I want the other side of the world to hear their stories. And he said, why? And I reflected on his question of why. And I said, I think when I was little, during wartime, I wanted people to hear me. Because I thought and I felt that I was not heard. And I thought about how the world can just be silent about what is happening in Iraq. He said, then go. And I went inside Mosul, and I what I saw in Mosul, the dead bodies were still under the rubbles. An entire city was down. It was reduced to rubbles. And children were out of school for years because of the curriculum that ISIS imposed, where they eliminated music, philosophy, art, and they implemented new curriculum such as physical preparation and jihad study. So many parents, they refrained from sending their children to school to study under ISIS. And that meant that some children were supposed to be in third and fourth grade. They never attended school. So I went around in the city, I interviewed people, and I listened to their stories. People did not ask me for money or food. All they said was, listen to what I've been through. Go tell our story. The amount of destruction I've seen there, I felt very hopeless. I was at an area, I sat on the rubbles of the mosque, of Al-Nuri Mosque, where ISIS leader gave his first sermon. I sat there and I was trying to just catch my breath to examine and check with myself because I was feeling so hopeless. That is when a little girl walked up to me with the hopeful eyes and she said, are you here to build us a school? Because I really want to attend a school. And I looked at her and, in my head, I was saying, if this little girl can have hope, why can't I? She extended her hand for me to help me down from the rubble. And then I promised myself that I would tell their stories. So those were the children who have not attended a school in Mosul. And then I came back to the United States after I filmed and I interviewed people in Mosul. But when I came back to the US, I think I was depressed for a couple of months. I've seen the reality there. I had water poisoning for 2 weeks in Iraq because of the water in Mosul that I had. And I started wondering about what is home for me. I visited my home back in Iraq and it was not the same. We were not the same children who left Iraq, little siblings all living together with their parents. I was a mother. My brother and sister were married. I did not feel that I was home. So when I returned to the US, I was very, very in a deep depression. And I was asking myself, what is home? What is my identity? What can I do back in Iraq or in Mosul? Where do I start from? There were a mix of so many different feelings I did not know how to process at that time. But then I started to accept the reality of I can accept the US to be my second home and have also Iraq to be my first home. I can have a set of diverse identities. I'm an American, I'm an Iraqi, I'm a mother, I'm a student. And then I think my journey shifted from there. That is when I produced the long documentary about life under ISIS in Mosul. That is when I started to talk about my story as a refugee from Iraq. I started to talk about the consequences of these stories, like after the 2003 and the millions of stories of Iraqis that are scattered around the world. How do we process those feelings? And then since that time, since 2018, I started going back to Iraq almost every year, connecting back to my home culture, trying to understand me and process my feelings, and trying to be part of this conversations of what did we learn from the war in Iraq? What do we learn from these stories? How do we come together to have this conversation, not only about Iraq, but also about the many places today around the country that are considered as war zones? Talk about those lost childhood. And this is something we do not realize, that when we talk about stolen childhood, this is the time in our lives that we will never get back. These are the times when we are shaping our core memories, and it will define who we are in our society. So if we are deprived from our basic rights to education, to food, to water, to clean water, our basic rights to just live in a happy family that has a mother and a father, parents, then what type of world are we creating for the next generation and for our children as well? These are just a highlight of one Iraqi story. And the reason I think I did not share my story for 10 years, from 2008 until 2018, is because I thought that my story didn't matter. I survived, I was able to survive. My dad wasn't killed. My brother was not tortured or killed in front of me. He did not lose a limb in front of me. Yes, my best friend was killed, but that's okay. Nothing really big to talk about. Because many other Iraqis, and it is safe to say millions of Iraqis, had worse stories than I did. So there's nothing worth sharing. But I think we learn from those stories. We learn just by talking to each other and highlighting those times and events, whether it's in Iraq or any other parts around the world. So I would like to thank you so much, and thanks our audience for joining us today to listen to one of the Iraqi stories.
Can you talk about the effects of depleted uranium on the people of Iraq?
We're not only talking about the impacts on the Iraqi people, we're talking about also the American military man who came back from this war and who has been impacted by the depleted uranium. Maybe if we bring in this conversation to the table and have it from a different perspective to say, hey, is not only impacting the Iraqi people, but let's look at our military man in the US and take it from this perspective, right? So if the U.S. military man who served in Iraq for a short period of time, whether it's a year or two, who were impacted by this, how about Iraqis who are eating this food on a daily basis from those areas, who are living in those areas? There is a doctor, an Iraqi doctor named Al-Azawi. He was talking about how children are just playing around those tanks and they're collecting the bullets and they're having them as souvenirs in their home. And he's just saying this is a disaster. If we don't have even education about it in Iraq to say, hey, you cannot do this, right? It is causing you cancer. So how do we anticipate finding a solution if we are considering this topic as a taboo? For me, and I think when we talk about lesson learned from Iraq, I would rather to talk about prevention rather than later on solutions. Because in our world, these solutions are just being lost in the talk of politics and numbers and money and militarizing wars and communities. So it's a very, very hard conversation because we don't even have, or I don't think we've even started to think about solutions for those children. Maybe we can start talking about how do we prevent supporting the genocides further to prevent more children from losing their parents. And then we present a solution on the table to say how the US can be part of the solution. And this is also some challenges that a lot of people find it hard to talk about. And I think a lot of Iraqis, for example, when they were accepted to be resettled to the United States, many of them resented this idea and they said, how do we go to the US, the country that invaded Iraq, right? So like you're talking about that same country. So I think, how do we push for prevention at the moment, and then we start talking about solution. I think you can start by, and this is something just becomes very surprising for my students to say, we invaded Iraq for those reasons. Like, is that real? Or I'm like, I don't make up things. I'm teaching. So I cannot make up things, right? So I think just taking and reflecting back on the Iraq's war, we call it the Iraq's war or the US invasion or the liberation of Iraq. And just let's take a look at why the US invaded Iraq or went to war with Iraq or in Iraq. And then as we highlight those reasons and then we look at the outcome of that, these are facts. These are not opinions. And I think if we just start with facts, we can start to have a better understanding. And then again, after we get our facts together, we just try to humanize this conflict to see what were the outcomes of those conflicts. How did it impact the US? How did it impact Iraq? And after all, how did it impact the Middle East? And I think it opened the door wide open for terrorist groups to exist in the Middle East, and not only in Iraq, and later on the emergence of ISIS. And then did we really bring democracy to Iraq and the Middle East? Just let's ask ourselves those big questions that we entered Iraq under those labels and names. Did we find any ties between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda? Not to defend Saddam Hussein. Saddam's regime was one of the, I think, worst in history. But to highlight those points and to say, did we bring democracy and stability to the Iraqi people? Did we stabilize the Middle East, or did the opposite? What impact the Iraq war had on our the US military, for example, right? What are those numbers? How much we spent on war in Iraq and later on in Middle East? So if we just start with these questions and look at numbers, I think we can get down to the reality of the past 20 years.